Okay, good evening everyone. My name is Gizelle and I'm the owner of Sacred Horse. I offer equine naturopathy services, and that takes the form of equine herbal medicine and equine myofunctional therapy, which is a form of sports massage and stretching to keep horses ticking over optimally. What we're going to talk about tonight is an overview of herbal medicine, particularly what it is, how to use herbal medicine to keep your horses healthy in the most natural way possible. Because herbal medicine is such a huge and complex topic, today what I'm going to do is run through a really broad overview of herbal medicine and how to use it for your horse. What I'm hoping is that you'll be able to walk away with an understanding of what herbal medicine can do for your horse and why one of the biggest problems with herbal medicine use today is that there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of incorrect dosing. As Julia mentioned, there will be some time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to submit your questions as we go. So, first of all, what we're going to cover is what herbal medicine is and what it can treat. We'll also look at the history of how herbal medicine was developed and the pharmacological knowledge that we now have to support the medicinal action of those herbs. We'll look at the benefits of herbal medicine when compared to pharmaceuticals, and then we'll actually get down to the nitty-gritty of how to use those herbs for your horse. So I'll talk about how to select herbs. We'll go through a real-life case study of what the selection process looks like. We'll talk briefly about dosages and how long you need to administer herbs, and then finally, as a takeaway, we'll have a chat about how to prepare dried herbs to make sure that you're getting the most benefit out of them, and we'll also talk about the use of herbs in competition horses very briefly. Alright, so what is herbal medicine? It's more formally known as phytotherapy or plant therapy, and it's the practice of preventing and treating physical and mental illness through the use of plants, plant materials and herbal preparations. It is a very traditional form of medicine and it predates our current pharmaceutical medications. You'll note that I discuss from time to time the use of herbal medicine as a prevention. That's something that our pharmaceutical medicines don't tend to do very well, although we are improving with that over time. You tend to find that the pharmaceutical medicines predominantly try to react once you have symptoms as opposed to prevent illness. Herbs are good for both. They can work on the prevention side and they can work on the treatment side. Archaeological evidence shows us that humans have been using medicinal plants for at least the last 60,000 years, and we know that animals self-medicate by eating or applying plant materials to their bodies when they have a problem. The interesting thing with animals is it's not just the fact that, for example, horses eat herbs as part of their normal grazing patterns. We also know that they actively seek out certain herbs when they're unwell to treat a particular issue. An example of this is a plant called greater celandine. This plant is specifically sought out by swallows who have blind chicks, and what they do is they find the plant, they break off a piece and they drop the juice of the plant into the eyes of the blind swallow chicks and it reverses blindness. So animals are a lot smarter than we think they are when it comes to being able to self-medicate. Now, horses are able to naturally self-medicate to some extent through their grazing practices. Obviously, it's a little bit more difficult for domesticated horses because they have a reduced area to roam. But this is why it's really important for us to make sure that we're sowing polycultures, meaning 2 or more species of plants in our paddocks, as opposed to monocultures. It allows them to pick and choose and determine what plants that they need. It's also possible to plant forage trees and herb shrubs in paddocks and to plant stable gardens for horses kept in stables and yards to give them a bit of an extra opportunity to self-medicate. I'm actually not going to go into much more detail about that tonight because I know that Mariette will be running another webinar through Horse SA later this month, and it's talking exactly on this topic of food as medicine. So if you are interested in that topic, you can register via the Horse SA website. Okay, so what exactly can herbal medicine treat? It will probably surprise you to know herbal medicine is still the most widely used medicine across the globe, and the reasons for that is due to its effectiveness, its low cost and its ease of accessibility. In the same way that there are pharmaceutical drugs for almost every condition, there are herbs for pretty much every condition as well. So the extent to which you want to use herbal medicine is entirely up to you. There are professional herbalists who strongly believe in only using herbal medicines to treat all conditions. And obviously at the other end of the scale, you've got the pharmaceutical industry who believes you should only use pharmaceutical medications. I tend to be on the conservative side. I like to use herbal medicines as a first point of call, and I actually use it even in my home life to treat most conditions. But there are times when I also like to go to pharmaceuticals. So it's really entirely up to you to what extent you want to medicate your horse with herbs versus use of pharmaceutical drugs. And you can also talk to your veterinarian about that. So understanding obviously that herbal medicine technically can be used to treat anything, I've just put together a few examples on some of the things you might like to think about using herbs for in your horse. They include pain and inflammation, arthritis, digestive problems, so ulcers, horses that don't gain weight very well, scouring or diarrhea, recurrent colic. Hormonal and behavioural problems can also be treated. Stress and anxiety, fertility issues, breeding support and lactation issues. Just like I said as a few examples, because the list can go on and on and on. Okay, so I'm going to just touch on the history of herbal medicine here so that you have an understanding of where it's come from and how we've got to the point we're at today with our herbs. As I mentioned earlier, there is evidence that we've been using herbal medicine for at least the past 60,000 years. Some of our knowledge as humans was gained by observing plant use by other animals, such as in the case of the greater celandine and the swallow, which I mentioned a bit earlier. The remainder of our knowledge was gained by using a system known as the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures is highly unscientific based on our current standards, but we need to understand that our ancestors were faith-based, not science-based, and they were traditionally pagans who believed in nature deities, and so they relied on nature to give them, to talk to them about the secrets of nature. So the doctrine of signatures works on the premise that nature leaves clues regarding the medicinal value of plant life. These clues to our ancestors took the form of the plant's shape, its colour, or its location. And although this is highly unscientific, it did actually work for our ancestors. So I've got some examples on the screen. When you're looking at shape, you look at a walnut and it looks like a brain. So much so that as a child, that's what I called them. They were brain nuts as far as I was concerned. And in fact, they are highly beneficial in maintaining healthy brain function because of their high level of omega-3 fatty acids. With regards to colour, I've got some examples up there. Red or purple plants or berries or flowers on the plants tend to assist with blood conditions. Pink is used for tissue or mucous membranes. Yellow is used for bile and hence is really good for liver conditions. White is used for connective tissue, orange helps with vitality, and blue is generally considered to be antiseptic in nature. The other one that's really interesting is location. So the notion here is that medicinal plants are going to grow wherever we're going to need them. And again, it's based on this concept that there are nature gods out there who assist humans. This was the thinking back at the time. So for something like arnica, arnica is found on rocky slopes where people are likely to stumble, fall and hurt themselves. And so it was found that it was used very successfully topically for bruises and strains and sprains, and still to this day you go to the chemist, you buy a tube of arnica to help restore your bruises. So now that you have lost all faith in herbal medicine because it sounds very woo-woo, I'm going to give you the pharmacology behind it and explain exactly how it does work. So pharmacology is the study of the action that a drug exerts on a cell, tissue, organ or organism. And the great thing about modern science is that it has actually allowed us to study the chemical components of these traditional medicinal plants and identify how they work. And it's done that by looking at the primary active constituents or the chemicals in the plant and explaining how the plant has worked and the effects that it has on the body. So although the process by which plants were initially identified by humans was a bit questionable by today's standards, we've actually got science to back it up now. Which is really fabulous. And more interestingly, the majority of today's pharmaceutical medicines that we're buying when we go to the chemist have been developed by studying our traditional herbal medicines and then turning them into an expensive drug. So why would you choose herbal medicine over a pharmaceutical medicine? In the first instance, plant-based medicines are a living form of medicine and they provide a natural solution to your health concerns. From a very philosophical, holistic perspective, the rationale that herbalists use is that you're using life to treat life or life force energy. So to put that into perspective, we survive on a day-to-day basis by eating plants and meats which are or were living things. We take their energy and their nutrients and we absorb them into our bodies to sustain us. In the same way, herbs provide us with life force energy. They also have nutrients and their chemical constituents heal us. When you take a pharmaceutical drug, you're taking one or a couple of active ingredients, but there's no nutritional benefit and there's no life force. So the way herbalists look at it is it's a very natural form of treating the body in a more holistic way with active constituents and nutrients and life force or energy. Another benefit of herbal medicine is that it is globally accessible and affordable, and it can't be patented because they're obviously plants that anyone can grow. The World Health Organization is so focused on herbal medicines and making herbal medicines available to everyone that they provide a huge amount of informational resources to people all over the world about herbs that are available and how to use them. The reality is that in Australia and in other countries, if the government didn't subsidise our pharmaceutical drugs, most of us wouldn't be able to afford to use them on a day-to-day basis. Another thing which I've touched on already is herbs serve the dual role of food and medicine. So by eating a healthy and balanced diet and incorporating herbs to maintain overall health, it becomes a fabulous prescription for disease prevention and also recovery from illness. Now the next point I'm going to make, it's a very important differentiation between herbs and pharmaceutical drugs, and that is that using the whole plant or the therapeutic part of a plant is actually more effective than isolating the plant's chemical constituents and prescribing them at quite high doses. To put that into context, a lot of our pharmaceutical drugs have been developed by isolating that primary active constituent, as I mentioned, and then prescribing it at a really high dose. And the result of that really high dose is that there are a long list of side effects, which are the ones that when you open the packet, they give you a list of, look out for these ones, and if you also get these ones, go back and see your doctor. There are three main reasons for that long list of side effects, and the first one is that, like I said, the dosage is very high. The same active constituents in herbal medicine wouldn't be prescribed at such a high dose as they do in the pharmaceutical drugs. What they're wanting to achieve in the pharmaceutical drugs is a much faster recovery period, but at a cost when it comes to side effects. In addition to that, and something that I love about herbs as medicine is that it's actually the combination of the different chemicals within the whole plant that make it easier for our body to accept and absorb the primary ingredients that we need. So to put that into context, your pharmaceutical drugs will have one or two active ingredients that they've taken from a whole live plant, and then you're getting these side effects. With the plants, we don't fully understand how it works, and hence why we can't replicate it in our pharmaceutical drugs, is they'll have the couple of active constituents that we're well aware exert a certain influence. In addition to that, the plant is filled with a whole heap of other chemicals that seem to work synergistically all together to prevent side effects from happening. So to give an example, you might have a drug with a side effect of headaches and nausea, but if you were to give that active constituent in its natural plant-based form, those side effects aren't known side effects, and we believe it's because of the other parts of the plant which are supporting absorption and supporting the other organs of the body to accept the main active constituent. And the third reason for side effects in pharmaceutical drugs is that often they employ toxic herbs that herbalists do not use just because we don't consider them safe enough. Obviously, pharmacists and doctors are the only people who are legally allowed to issue and prescribe poisonous goods, which is completely fair enough. But rather than prescribe what we would consider to be a toxic herb as a herbalist, we have a catalogue of other herbs that we can use. So we always go to safe, non-toxic, non-poisonous herbs and use those to treat, as opposed to using the toxic herbs which are often used in the pharmaceuticals. So an example of that is a plant called foxglove, and the plant itself is recognised globally as being a cardiac glycoside, which is a heart remedy. It normalises the pulse, it regulates heartbeat, it controls blood pressure, improves circulation and helps the heart with contraction and dilation. The thing is, the plant is highly poisonous, so herbalists don't use it. But the active constituents from that plant have been used by pharmaceuticals and turned into a drug called DOCTRINE. It's a very effective pharmaceutical, but it does have a huge amount of side effects as well, including nausea and vomiting, anxiety and depression, skin rash, blurred vision, and the list goes on. And that's because at the end of the day, the drug is a poison, so not all bodies are going to accept it particularly well. I'm not saying in any way that these drugs shouldn't be prescribed because they are life-saving drugs, but it's just interesting to note the differences in the way we look at prescribing between herbal medicine and pharmaceutical medicine. What I don't like to see is individuals shaming each other for what decision they make. There are the people who prefer to take pharmaceuticals, and that's really fabulous. There are people who prefer to take herbal medicines, and that's really fabulous. At the end of the day, it's an individual choice. And in fact, what I prefer to see, particularly with horses, is where a herbalist and a veterinarian work together and they can come up with a whole solution that might include a combination of Western medicine and traditional medicine working together. Okay, so we'll get down to a bit more of the nitty-gritty of how you can apply some of this stuff to your horse. So how do you select a herb? What I tend to find with a lot of people I talk to is that when something's going wrong with their horse, they're talking to a friend or they're going to a forum and they're getting some advice on buying a herb that someone else has used. Or they'll call a herbal supplier and say, oh, this is wrong with my horse, what do I do? They get recommended a single herb from the range, but the herbal supplier doesn't really know the full story with that individual horse. Then the herb doesn't work and the person thinks herbal medicine is rubbish. At the end of the day, though, there are several reasons why the herb hasn't worked. Potentially the wrong herb was recommended because, like I said, it's just been recommended by a friend or by someone who doesn't know your horse particularly well. Sometimes you'll find that feeding a single herb isn't enough to solve the problem because the horse has a chronic problem or because there are multiple factors. So it's not just one issue that you're noticing, there's that plus 2 or 3 other things that aren't quite working right in the horse, and all of those need to be addressed. A third and very common problem that I find is underdosing or not feeding enough of the herb, because the dosage on the back of the packet is a really generic low dose because they don't know your horse. They're not going to recommend a very high dose, but the result can also be that you're getting a substandard outcome. The other reason herbs sometimes don't work is because they're only effective when they're fed in combination with something else, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the fact that perhaps a herb hasn't worked for a friend or it hasn't worked for you, sometimes it's just because you haven't been given the right information and the herb hasn't been given to the horse properly to get the desired outcome. So when it comes to the process of actually selecting a herb or herbs for your horse, you need to look past just the single issue you think they have and do a whole assessment of the horse. So look at their coat. Is it shiny or is it dull? Is their skin healthy or is it dry and flaky? Do they hold their weight well, or do you struggle to keep the weight on them? Look at their eyes. Are they keen and bright or are they yellow and gunky? And so on and so forth. Look at the whole horse and see what's going on. Once you've made a list of all the things that you think aren't quite right with your horse, then you actually aim to treat each and every single one of those issues, because they can all be pointing to different things. What we'll do in a moment is we'll actually go through a case study, and I'll explain to you how we do that in a bit more detail. But first I just want to go through some more background information so that you've got a more complete picture before we get to that point. Okay, so looking at the next point, which is concept of synergism. There are literally hundreds of herbs that a herbalist can select from, and we will decide what herb we're going to use based on each of those presentations that I've just discussed with you. We've got herbs that will have one use, or sometimes they have a few primary uses, plus they'll have some secondary actions. So for example, turmeric, which is quite popular at the moment, it has a primary action of treating pain and inflammation, plus secondary to that, it also helps to protect the liver and reduce cholesterol. So this is a really good herb for horses who have something like arthritis and mild liver weakness, which is a combination that you find in older horses all the time as their bodies are starting to deteriorate a little bit. You might also then find another herb which has a primary action of treating a liver weakness with a secondary action of managing pain and inflammation. If you feed those two herbs together, it gives a stronger total effect in terms of assisting the horse. So that's what I'm talking about with synergism. It's herbs that complement each other and fit together like a perfect puzzle piece. Moving on to the next point, checking for drug interactions. This is so absolutely essential. Reiterating again, herbs have active constituents in the same way that pharmaceutical medicines have active constituents. So if your horse is on any pharmaceutical medications, I wouldn't recommend going and selecting herbs yourself, but you'd need to talk to a qualified herbalist, because we've got the background to understand the chemical components of the herbal medicines. We can also understand the active constituents of the pharmaceutical medicines and work out whether those herbs can be given together safely or not. We can also talk to the vet on your behalf if they have prescribed a prescription medication to make sure that we're all on the same page with treatment outcomes for the horse. And finally, the other thing you need to start looking out for nowadays, which wasn't so much of a problem 5–10 years ago, is making sure that you don't buy restricted or potentially toxic herbs. I'm actually finding that more and more herbs are becoming available online and also over the counter that I wouldn't call over-the-counter herbs. It's the same as being able to go to a chemist and buy Panadol because that's relatively safe, but then there are other drugs such as Panadine Fort, which you can't buy without a script because it's highly addictive. Same goes with herbs. There are some that I've seen popping up in herbal stores and online that should be used with extreme caution because they either exert a really strong effect on the horse or because they can be slightly toxic if given at an incorrect dose. I know that adds a whole extra dimension of complexity that you probably don't want to have to deal with, but what I've done is I've developed a list of herbs that shouldn't be purchased over the counter or dried, and I've had a chat to Julie, and what we'll do is when we send out the webinar replay link, I'll send you out a link to download that document as well so that you have access to that. Just a bit of a cheat sheet so that if you are buying herbs, you make sure you don't buy from that list of restricted/unsafe herbs for your horse. Alright, so down to our case study. What we've got in our case study is a 29-year-old horse, so quite an old guy. He's not on any medications, and the things we're dealing with are a heart murmur, arthritis, difficulty maintaining weight, low-grade ongoing scarring or diarrhea, flaky skin and a dull coat, and slow hoof growth. So I know as a herbalist that difficulty maintaining weight combined with the scouring, the poor skin and coat are suggestive of liver weakness, which is something that's actually really common in older horses. Just generally speaking, their bodies are starting to break down and not work as effectively. The liver's been detoxing things for a hell of a lot of years and it's just starting to slow down. The poor skin and coat condition, the slow hoof growth, and I don't have it on the screen, but thrush as well in this horse, are suggestive of poor peripheral circulation. So that just means that circulation to the extremities isn't working particularly well. Again, it's common in aged horses because the vessels of the circulatory system start to break down. Plus, we know that this guy has a heart murmur, so that's also compromising the adequate circulation. So I know it sounds like a lot of problems, but keep in mind that this is an old horse, and in the same way that an old 80-year-old person requires extra support, so does an old horse, and they're going to have more issues. In addition to that, as I mentioned, a lot of horse owners only see the one problem in their horse, whereas if you look closer and compare your horse to what you would consider to be an optimally healthy horse, you'd actually start to notice perhaps some just other little signs that you hadn't noticed before. So quite often when you're looking at a horse, you start off with one issue and you notice that there are actually a couple of other things that you just want to tweak. So here's my prescription for this guy. Now the formula that I've got up here is more complex than what I would expect you guys to come up with, so don't stress about that. I'm just going to run you through the process of exactly how the herbs are selected and the dynamics between them. So if you look at the first four on my list, I've got hawthornberry, frankincense, turmeric and dandelion root. Now these are my primary herbs, which I spoke a little bit on before, meaning that these are the herbs that I'm relying on the most heavily, and I'm most likely going to give a higher dose of these herbs compared to the other herbs. The final two herbs, which are the clivers and either ginkgo or ginger, they're my secondary herbs. They're playing more of a supportive role, and I prescribe them as a much lower dose. Now hawthornberry is an excellent cardioamphoteric, which is a heart normalizer. So what it does, it can't cure the heart murmur. No one can cure that. But what it does support is overall heart health and nutrition and function, just to support the horse and keep them ticking over. It's really good for age-related heart degeneration, and unlike something like foxglove, it is an entirely safe herb. The second one on the list is frankincense. This one is used to treat pain and inflammation, and it's really, really good for arthritic conditions. It's actually my personal favourite for arthritis. It also has the secondary action of stimulating circulation, aiding digestion and treating diarrhea. So if you look at what our horse was presenting with, it's actually helping to address about 3 or 4 of the things on our list all in one. The third herb, turmeric. This is an anti-inflammatory which is commonly used to treat arthritis, and it also has a secondary action of protecting and maintaining liver health. So again, it's addressing the arthritis and the liver problems. Now I know I mentioned that normally my primary herbs I give at a high dose, but turmeric is the exception because the smell is pungent, the taste can be overwhelming, so I tend to give the lowest dose possible of turmeric just because horses may not accept it. If it's a fussy horse, I don't go anywhere near turmeric because I know that they're not going to take it. And my fourth primary herb is dandelion root. Now you've got to be particular when you're buying dandelion. You can either buy the root or the leaf because they exert completely different actions upon the body. The leaf is primarily used as a diuretic, which isn't what I'm wanting here, whereas the root is a liver tonic, helping to restore the liver. The root also has a secondary action as an alternative, which is the blood purifier, and it helps to resolve skin conditions and it supports arthritic conditions. So again, that's addressing a few of our issues in this horse. When I move on to my secondaries, clivers is primarily a lymphatic tonic and a diuretic, and that's going to help with the flaky skin and the dry hair. It also has a secondary anti-inflammatory action, and again it supports the liver, so that's why I've selected that as opposed to potentially a different lymphatic tonic. And finally, I'm including either ginkgo or ginger. Both of these herbs improve stimulation, so it's a little bit about which one you prefer to use. I tend to swap between ginger and ginkgo depending on the time of the year. I use ginger during the winter months because it's a very internally warming herb and it supports with arthritis, which tends to get a little bit worse in winter, whereas I use ginkgo in the summer months because in Australia it's hot enough already without adding internal heat to the horse. The difference between the two is ginkgo tends to help to tone and strengthen the veins, and it also increases mental cognition by increasing the blood supply to the brain. So if you've got a horse who is just a little bit dull, not as switched on, a bit disengaged with its environment, ginkgo is a really good one because it will increase their mental stimulation. Ginger, on the other hand, is more primarily focused on dilating the blood vessels and providing arthritic support. So, like I said, again, it's just about personal preference there. Now, this prescription, it's not a forever prescription. So some of these herbs I would continue to prescribe ongoing, whereas others I'd remove, and I'll explain how I decide that a bit later. As the horse owner, though, when you're buying herbs for your horse, if you haven't had a herbal consult, your prescriptions are not going to be anywhere near this complex, and that's okay. If you can get clear enough when looking at your horse to say, okay, I need something for the heart, I need something for arthritis, and I need something for the liver, and you get 3 herbs, you're going to get some pretty good results with that horse. So how long do you actually need to give herbs to your horse? That really depends on 2 factors. The first is the type of condition, and the second is the equine blood cycle. So if you're looking at the type of condition, you need to say, well, is this a condition that can be resolved, in which case treatment has a finite period, or is it something that can never be resolved, such as the heart murmur, such as arthritis? It's something that's always going to be there. If you are looking at a condition that doesn't have a finite period, such as the arthritis, such as the heart condition, you're going to need to continue to provide support throughout the life cycle of the horse. On the other hand, if it's something that has a finite period, what herbalists look at is an equine blood cycle. So in herbal medicine, herbalists recommend treatment occurs over the course of a blood cycle, which is how long it takes for the body to replace all of the cells within the body. The intention is that as the body heals with treatment, it produces healthy blood cells which can then continue to replicate once the horse is in that totally healthy state post-treatment. In humans, the blood cycle is between 100 and 120 days, so you might have heard about a 3-month treatment period, and that's about right in humans. But for horses, the blood cycle is 145 days. So realistically, you're looking at an optimal treatment period of about 5 months for a condition to fully resolve. If you're using dried herbs as your means of medication, though, it's actually not that expensive. I've worked out it's about a cost of $5 to $10 a week in herbs for the duration of the treatment, so for that 5-month period. The exact cost is going to depend on which herbs you've selected, and it's also going to depend on how big your horse is, because the bigger the horse, the more herbs they need. So if we look back on our case study example, we know that the heart condition and the arthritis are ongoing problems, so we're going to need to medicate those ones ongoing. I tend to find, though, that when you've been medicating for a period of time, the horse becomes less and less dependent on the medications, which in a way is opposite to some pharmaceuticals where we become more and more dependent. I've found in real life scenarios that if an owner has run out of herbs and the horse goes without for a week, they actually don't seem to suffer in any way, particularly with problems like arthritis. I don't find that it regresses and the condition worsens. I also find that in some cases we can reduce the dosage of the herbs the longer the horse has been on them. So that's something that we can play with a little bit. On the other hand, in our case study, the liver condition, the scouring and the flaky skin should be resolved within the equine blood cycle period. We'd assess that over the course of treatment because every horse is going to be a little bit different. But what I'd probably do is, because the turmeric provides liver support as well as arthritic support. Once the scouring had been eliminated and the horse's liver was looking a bit stronger, I'd probably take out the dandelion root altogether and just rely on the turmeric for that very low level ongoing support for this older horse. Okay, now for this section on dosage, I'm actually going to give you a really very broad overview because the topic itself is just way too complex for this type of forum. The thing that is most important for you to understand, as I've touched on already, is that the standard dose recommendations you're getting on the back of your equine herb packets tend to be too low. And as I've mentioned, the reason for this is that the herbal suppliers need to err on the side of caution because they're providing you with advice without actually knowing your horse. The problem with this is that in some cases, if I give a human example, sometimes the dosage you're giving is like a quarter of a paracetamol tablet to treat a migraine. So as you would know, that's going to have zero effect whatsoever in providing any sort of relief for that migraine. To give you a bit of perspective, for this old horse that we've been discussing through the case study, you'd probably get a recommendation through the back of the packet that they'd need 5 tablespoons per day of that given herb, when the reality is a proper herbal dose would probably be 2/3 of a cup potentially given over the course of a day. So that's a huge variance in what you're being recommended on the back of the packet to what you actually need to give the horse. To actually calculate dosage, you've got 2 options. The first one is to refer to the dosages in a veterinary herbal text. The one I tend to recommend is Wynn and Fugger's Veterinary Herbal Medicine. It's very reputable, but it's also very expensive because it is the primary text that animal herbalists and veterinarians would use. The second is to calculate the dosage based on Clark's rule. I'm not going to go through how that works, but effectively the dosages that are given for humans is for a 70 kilogram adult. Clark's rule works by taking into account weight adjustments for children and animals and then determining exactly how much should be given by way of dosage. Obviously, because a horse is considerably heavier than a 70 kilogram adult, you're giving a much higher dose than you would give to a human. Something else you need to consider when looking at dosage is there is no single dosage figure. What herbal medicine does is give a dosage range. So for example, for that 70 kilogram adult, it might be between 1 ml and 1.5 ml per day. And as I mentioned on before, we determine as herbalists exactly how much we're going to give based on a range of factors. So is it a primary or secondary herb? Primary herbs going to have a higher dose than the secondary herbs, generally speaking. We look at the horse's condition. If the horse is quite weak, we're going to start on a lower dose to see how well the horse tolerates the medicines. If the horse is more robust, we might start with a slightly higher dose. And we also look at palatability. So is the horse going to accept this particularly well? Does it smell? Does it taste good or does it taste bad? If it's one that they're not likely to accept very well, we tend to give a lower dose just to see how well they'll accept it. And in terms of how often to feed herbs, as a minimum, obviously, every day the horse needs to get herbs. Optimally, the daily prescribed dose is supposed to be spread over 3 doses, usually mixed into a hard feed. But the reality is most of us can't manage that, and that's okay. So if you feed your horse once a day, mix the herbs in a hard feed once a day. If you feed twice a day, split the dose over 2 feeds. And if you feed 3 times a day, or you're lucky enough to have a adjustment where your horse is fed 3 times a day, split the dosage across 3 feeds. The reason we recommend smaller doses more frequently is that they provide a more effective support to the body over the course of the entire day. My old boy, he gets fed twice a day because he's out on pasture, so I spread his herbs over 2 feeds and he does really well on that. So it's not something I want you to stress over too much, but just know if you can feed more regularly, do so. If you can't, that's okay. All right. I've included this next slide because I can assure you that most people don't quite feed their dried herbs correctly to their horses. And just running through this, I'm going to give you the best way to get the most out of the herbs so that you're getting the most bang for your buck. So when you're using dried herbs at home in your kitchen, whether it be for cooking or to make a herbal tea, you rehydrate those herbs, not consciously usually, but the act of rehydrating the herbs does more than make them more palatable. It actually helps to release the active constituents that make them a medicine. So to rehydrate the herbs for your horse, you literally make them a cup of herbal tea, similar to what you would do for yourself. So place the herbs first of all into a non-metallic container. And the reason I say that is because metals actually react with some of the active constituents and renders them completely ineffective. So you've put the money into buying this herb expecting to get an outcome, and by putting it in a metal container, you've then actually destroyed the effects that you would otherwise get. So you're better off using a glass container or ceramics or plastic or something else other than a metal container. Next, same as you would do when making a cup of tea, pour about a cup of clean water over the herbs. For the most part you'd use boiling water, but if the herb is a type that becomes quite slimy when you add water to it, and I'm talking about like your slippery elms and your marshmallows, you use cold water for those herbs instead. So that would be the only difference, but 90% of the time you're using boiling water, same as a cup of tea. Once you've added the water, place a lid over the top and brew it for 5 to 10 minutes. And the reason you're putting a lid on the top is because, particularly if we're talking about a hot preparation, you lose some of the active constituents in the steam. So you're wanting to keep all of that steam in so that you're getting the best medicinal mixture that you can put together. And then once you've finished brewing it, it's really as simple as pouring the tea and the herbs all together into your horse's feed and mixing it through. So it's as simple as that, really. If your horse is fussy, you might want to add some molasses or some applesauce or something that you know they find highly palatable to encourage them to eat. Some horses accept herbs really well and tend to find that if you miss feeding their herbs in a feed, they get quite upset about it because they enjoy the flavour, whereas others are just fusspots and they go, I don't know what this is, it smells, it tastes funny, I don't want to touch it. So for those horses, you just have to improvise a little bit. In addition to preparing the herbs correctly, you also need to just do a little bit of research in some cases on the herbs that you've selected and whether they work better under circumstances, under certain circumstances than others. So as an example, again, turmeric, because it's so popular at the moment, I keep on touching on it, it should always be fed with a lipid, which is a fat. And the reason for that is its active constituent, curcumin, is not easily absorbed by the body, and a lot of it just passes out of the body with the urine and the fecal matter. Because you clearly have spent money on this medicine and you want to get the most out of it, you need to add an oil to the horse's feed when you're feeding the turmeric to make sure that they're absorbing as much curcumin as possible and you're getting the best outcome. So just be a little bit savvy and do a little bit of research on the herbs to see if there's anything else you need to feed. Okay, and on a final note, just looking at herbs in competition, some herbs are restricted in competition and you need to keep that in mind. Not all, but a certain proportion, so you need to be a little bit savvy. As a standard rule, and again this is a very broad rule, herbs which are prohibited in competition include stimulants, sedatives, with chamomile being the exception there because it's commonly found in pastures across the world, anti-inflammatory herbs, and salicylate-containing herbs. Salicylates are converted into salicylic acid in the body, which is the active ingredient in aspirin. So if you were to do a drug test, it would read in the same way as a horse would have been given an aspirin equivalent. If you want to know for certain whether a herb is prohibited in your horse sport, you actually need to check with your sporting regulator. I know off the top of my head for any sports governed by the FEI, you can check the FEI Prohibited Substances database. That's an interactive online database and you can search for herbs by their common and scientific name. not as savvy with the other sporting bodies, so it becomes your responsibility just to check with them what is and isn't allowed. While herbalists have a general understanding of which herbs can and can't be used, at the end of the day, if you receive a herbal prescription, it's up to you to double check whether those herbs are acceptable or not, and if they're not, you need to go back to the herbalist and ask them to change one or several of the herbs if you find that they're not quite right. Alright, so that's all for the main body of the presentation today, and I'll take questions in just a minute. If you are interested in more information or if you'd like a consult, my website is sacredhorse.com.au. I've also got a Facebook page and a Twitter page, so you can keep up to date on any articles or special offers that I might post or publish, and you can also sign up to my newsletter through the Facebook page as well.